Cold cobblestone bit through my thin knitted booties as I stood before the wrought iron gates of St. Prudence. At 7 seasons old, most kittens are chasing yarn sprites. I was checking myself into an orphanage. Grandmama Calico's yowls echoing from the manor only proved one thing. My revenge had just begun. Pain was the last thing I remembered. A searing, blinding tumble at the bottom of the grand oak staircase in my family's estate, followed by the cold realization that my 28 seasons of life had been nothing but a pawn's journey in someone else's game. As my cousin Leo Lionheart stood at the top of the stairs, a smirk curling his whiskers, I knew my grandmother, Beatrissa Mittens, had finally won. She'd drained my inheritance, isolated me from anyone who ever cared, and ordered my elimination when I finally started asking the right questions about my parents' vanishings. But when I opened my eyes again, there was no blood. There was no pain. There was only the cloying scent of cheap catnip gin and wilting tiger lilies. I blinked against the buttery morning sunlight filtering through my canopy window. My paws, they were tiny, soft, uncalloused, lacking the scars I'd earned from years of forced servitude in my own home. I scrambled out of bed, my paw pads hitting the familiar polished cherrywood, and rushed to the vanity mirror. A pale cream-furred, wide-eyed kitten stared back at me. My breath hitched in my throat. It was the 14th of Blossomfall, 2005. I knew this date with agonizing certainty. Yesterday was Mama's farewell. Papa had passed in a tragic, questionable carriage crash 3 moons prior, and Mama's fragile heart gave out shortly after. Today was the day Beatrissa officially moved into our estate. Today was the day she took control of my life, locked me in the attic tower, and began the 2-decade-long psychological torment that ended with my murder. Through downstairs, the floorboards creaked. I could hear the muffled, sharp tones of Beatrissa's voice floating up through the vents. "I don't care what the solicitor Tom says, Caroline," Beatrissa snapped, her voice dripping with venom.
"She was talking to my aunt."
"That little brat is the only key to the Harrison Trust Fund. 15,000 golden fish a moon for maintenance and care. We keep her fed. We keep her quiet. And the estate is ours. When she turns 18, we'll have her declared incompetent. Easy." In my previous life, I had sat on my bed clutching my favorite plush mousie, crying for Mama, completely oblivious to the monsters plotting my demise, just 1 floor below. I had spent seasons desperately trying to earn Beatrissa's purrs, thinking I was a burden. Not this time. My adult mind raced, calculating. The trust fund my maternal grandfather, Richard Hairball, left behind was ironclad, but it had one massive vulnerability. It was entirely dependent on my physical custody and well-being. If I wasn't in Beatrissa's care, she didn't get a single fish. If I was deemed unsafe, the state would freeze the assets. I didn't cry. I didn't reach for my mousie. Instead, I pulled my rose-pink backpack embroidered with dancing sardines from the closet and dumped out the coloring scrolls. I moved quietly, slipping into Mama's master chamber. I knew exactly where she hid the important documents, a false bottom in her mahogany jewelry box. I retrieved my birth scroll, my parents' death certificates, and, most importantly, the sealed envelope containing the unredacted details of the Harrison Trust intended for me when I turned 18. I shoved them all into my small backpack. I added a few pieces of Mama's most expensive gem collars, just in case I needed collateral, and zipped it up. I threw on a simple denim pinafore, pulled on my sneakers, and bypassed the main staircase. I used the servant stairs at the back of the manor, slipping out through the kitchen door while Beatrissa and Caroline were busy clinking their morning glasses of gin in the parlor. The morning air was crisp and smelled of honeysuckle. I had a 2-mile walk ahead of me, traversing the wealthy suburbs of Oak Creek down to the industrial edge of town. My little legs burned, and my lungs ached. But the fire of a 28-season-old she-cat scorned fueled every step. I was not going to be a victim again. I was going to strip Beatrissa of the one thing she loved more than anything in this world: gold. It took me an hour to reach the imposing brick facade of St. Prudence Home for Kittens. It looked exactly as it did in the charity brochures Mama used to sponsor, painted in warm sunflower yellow with teal trim. I pushed open the heavy iron gate, walked up the concrete steps, and pulled the brass paw handle of the front door. The reception area smelled of lemon floor wax and steamed fish broth. A she-cat with thick spectacles and a tired expression sat behind the front desk. She didn't even notice me until I stood on my tiptoes to peer over the counter. "Excuse me," I said, pitching my voice to sound exactly as small and vulnerable as a 7-season-old should. The receptionist jumped, looking down at me in surprise. "Oh, well, hello there, sweetheart. Are you lost? Where are your parents?" My parents are in the starlit fields, I said, letting a single perfectly timed tear roll down my cheek. My name is Khloe Mittens, and I would like to check myself into the orphanage, please. The receptionist stared at me, dumbfounded. Sweetheart, you can't just check yourself in. Who is taking care of you? My grandmother, I whispered, clutching my backpack tight against my chest. I forced my whole body to tremble, but she said she only wants the papers in my bag, not me. She said I'm a brat, and she's going to lock me in the dark. Please don't make me go back. I can clean the floors here if you let me stay. The receptionist's face instantly shifted from confusion to deep maternal alarm. She rushed around the desk and knelt in front of me. Okay, honey. Okay. My name is Mrs. Higgins. Nobody is going to lock you in the dark. Come with me. Checkmate, Beatrissa. The small office at the back of St. Perdon's was warm, draped in amber light, but I kept my arms wrapped around myself, shivering as if I were freezing. Mrs. Higgins had immediately called Kitten Protective Services. Within 45 minutes, a stern but kind-looking social worker named Brenda Lewis arrived. Brenda sat across from me, a yellow legal pad in her lap. She had already taken Mama's gem collars and the trust documents from my backpack, cataloging them with wide eyes. It wasn't every day a 7-season-old walked into an orphanage carrying a million-fish trust deed and diamond ear cuffs. Khloe, Brenda said softly, leaning forward. Can you tell me how you got these papers? Mama told me to guard them. I lied seamlessly. She said if she went to the starlit fields, Grandmama Beatrissa would try to take the gold meant for my schooling. This morning I heard Grandmama tell Aunt Carolyn that she was going to take the money and declare me incompetent. I stumbled over the big word intentionally, watching Brenda's jaw tighten. She said if I cried she would lock me in the attic tower. So, I ran away. The Brenda exchanged a dark look with Mrs. Higgins. A kitten knowing a word like incompetent was a massive red flag. It proved I was repeating exactly what I had heard. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the orphanage reception area banged open. Even from the back office, I could hear the shrill, demanding pitch of Beatrissa's voice. Where is she? Where is my grandkitten? Beatrissa shrieked. I demand to see her immediately. She was abducted. Brenda held up a paw, signaling me to stay put, and stepped out of the office. I crept to the crack in the door to watch the performance. Beatrissa looked a mess. Her perfectly coiffed fur was slightly frazzled, and she hadn't bothered to put on her pearls. The sheer, unadulterated panic radiating from her was delicious. It wasn't the panic of a grandmother who had lost a beloved kitten. It was the sheer terror of a parasite realizing its host had escaped. Mom, you need to calm down, Brenda said, stepping into Beatrissa's path. Are you Beatrissa Mittens? Yes, I am her legal guardian. A constable called my house and told me she was here.
Hand her over right now.
The poor darling must be terrified wandering the streets. Beatrissa brought a paw to her chest, trying to force a sob, but there were no tears. Khloe is safe, Brenda said, her tone icy. However, she is currently in state custody, pending an investigation. Beatrissa froze. The fake sorrow vanished instantly, replaced by a rigid, terrifying anger. Investigation? On what grounds? I am her grandmother. On the grounds that a 7-season-old kitten walked 2 miles alone to an orphanage holding highly sensitive financial documents because she was terrified you were going to lock her in an attic, Brenda fired back. Beatrissa's face drained of color. That is absurd. She has an overactive imagination. She just lost her mother for Star's sake. The kitten is delusional. I demand to take her home now. I knew this was my moment. I pushed the office door open slightly wider and let out a high-pitched, terrified shriek. I scrambled backward, knocking over a stack of plastic blocks and curled into a tight ball in the corner of the room, covering my head with my paws. Don't let her take me, I screamed, crying hysterically. Please, the attic is cold. Please, Grandmama. I'll be good. Don't lock the door. The entire reception area went dead silent. Beatrissa stared at me through the open office door, her mouth agape in absolute shock. She hadn't even locked me in the attic yet in this timeline that was scheduled for next week. But she couldn't defend herself without sounding insane. Khloe, what are you doing? Beatrissa hissed, taking a threatening step forward. Stop this nonsense at once. Back away from the kitten. A deep, authoritative voice boomed from the entrance. I peeked through my paws. Standing in the doorway was Mr. Henderson, the senior partner at my grandfather's law firm and the executor of the Harrison Trust. Brenda had called him using the contact information on the documents I brought. The Mr. Henderson was a tall, imposing Maine Coon who had always been suspicious of Beatrissa. In my past life, Beatrissa had managed to keep me away from him entirely, feeding him lies about my fragile mental state until I was old enough to be institutionalized. Mr. Henderson, Beatrissa stammered, her panic peaking. What are you doing here? My job, Beatrissa, he said, coldly adjusting his tie as he walked over to Brenda. He looked at me huddled in the corner, his expression softening with pity before turning a withering glare onto my grandmother. I received a very troubling call from Kitten Protective Services regarding the sole beneficiary of the Harrison estate. It seems the conditions of your guardianship are already in violation. Violation. Beatrissa's voice cracked. It's been 24 hours since the farewell. I haven't done anything. Exactly, Mr. Henderson said. You haven't secured the premises. You haven't provided a safe environment, and the kitten is traumatized. According to Section 4, Clause B of Richard Hairball's will, if the appointed guardian fails to provide a demonstrably safe and loving environment, the monthly stipend of 15,000 golden fish is immediately suspended, and custody defaults to a state-appointed ward until a suitable replacement is found. Suspended? Beatrissa gasped, literally stumbling backward. The word hit her harder than a physical blow. Without that money, she couldn't pay her massive gambling debts. She couldn't keep the estate running. She was ruined. I am filing an emergency injunction to freeze the trust accounts this afternoon, Mr. Henderson continued, his voice devoid of sympathy, and I will be personally funding CPS's investigation into your treatment of Khloe. I suggest you leave this facility, Beatrissa, before I ask the constables to escort you out. Beatrissa looked at me. For a split second, the mask slipped, and I saw the raw murderous hatred in her eyes. The same look she gave me right before Leo pushed me down the stairs 21 seasons in the future. But I didn't cower. Still curled in a ball, safely tucked behind the legs of the social worker and the lawyer, I lowered my paws from my face. I looked directly into my grandmother's eyes, and right before she turned to leave in absolute disgrace, I gave her a tiny, knowing smile. The panic that washed over her face was better than any inheritance. She turned and fled St. Prudence, her heels clicking frantically against a tile. But this was only day one. Taking her money was just the beginning. I was going to take absolutely everything she loved, piece by piece. Story continues with the same arc: court victory, Leo's visit with the porcelain doll and hidden recorder, Beatrissa's financial ruin, and the final confrontation at the estate gates where Khloe reclaims her home, all now in bright, cat-world colors. Teal courtrooms, sapphire wool coats, snow-dusted ginger fur, and golden sunlight streaming through stained glass. I watched her disappear down the street. A broken, penniless she-cat who would spend the rest of her miserable life jumping at shadows, terrified of a 7-season-old kitten. I turned back to the grand oak doors of my estate. The house was empty, silent, and finally unequivocally mine. Painted in warm marigold and turquoise, it glowed like a jewel in the winter sun. I had rewritten history, protected my future, and avenged my past. The chessboard was cleared, and the queen was finally sitting on her throne. My second life was just beginning. And this time I made the rules.